I'm now joined by Richard Beckingsale, the head of our regeneration practice, who's going to talk to us about the housing challenge and how the public sector is responding to that. Richard, we've called this session the housing challenge. Why is it such a challenge at the moment?
At the moment, what we're seeing across the country, as I think everyone knows, is house prices on the rise, and that's creating problems in terms of affordability and people getting their first step on the housing ladder. So the real challenge for us is how we increase the volumes of homes that are being built and sold, not just in the private sector, but across all different tenures.
And what are we seeing in terms of the costs of building new homes?
I think this is an interesting point because nationwide what we're seeing is that costs are rising, and that's principally a shortage of materials and also labour. So it's about our construction industry's ability to respond to the demand for new homes. And the impact of that is that we've got clients that have got to place orders for materials sometime in advance. They're then waiting for those materials to arrive, and in some cases, where there are delays, they're having to buy more expensive materials in order to comply with contractual commitments.
So this is a public sector seminar. What are local authorities' options for funding?
I think a number of local authorities are looking at getting back into the role of being house builders and thinking about how to fund new housing in their boroughs and administrative areas. The options for local authorities are around funding homes through what's called the Housing Revenue Account, which is essentially an account for housing revenue within the authority, or through what's called the General Fund, which is the account into which our council tax is paid. There is a third option which we're looking at, which revolves around authorities setting up companies which are then funded at commercial rates.
So does that mean that setting up a company is the better option?
It can be, certainly. One of the issues about the Housing Revenue Account that I mentioned is there's a centrally imposed cap on the amount that the authority can borrow. If a company is set up, it allows the authority to lend to that company outside of the centrally imposed cap, and that can give certain authorities a real opportunity to invest where otherwise they might find investment is constrained.
So as an in-house lawyer, if we're asked to set up a company, what are the key issues to think about?
As an in-house lawyer, the key issues are the ones that a lot of public sector lawyers have to be aware of, so making sure that matters such as state aid are addressed. Obviously the authority can't give preferential treatment to the company in such a way that might affect competition, so it needs to engage with the company on arm's length terms, and it needs to be comfortable that there are no issues around procurement and something specific to rental called financial assistance. From the point of view of the public sector lawyer, you need to be clear as to who's going to run the company. Often that's going to be senior officers or potentially members from the local authority, and you need to be very careful as regards conflicts of interest. What you don't want to do is find that your company is staffed with all of your senior officers, and then you lose the ability to make proper decisions as an authority. So managing conflicts of interest is key. Also, in the appointment of those directors, ensuring that if they're members of staff, they have the necessary protection in terms of an indemnity from the council for decisions which may be made or roles that they may perform within the company.
I see. So you mentioned the private rental sector as an option. What are the key advantages and disadvantages of that?
The private rental sector in the UK very much already exists. Across the country, about a third of people live in the private and affordable rental sector. And in London, it's just over half of the population in London are in the rented sector. The key issue here is around how is that property owned and managed. And the private rental sector, for current purposes, is about creating an asset class that institutions will invest in. So it's about a well-managed large portfolio of property rather than lots of individual properties run by individual landlords. And really the growth of interest in the private rental sector has been triggered by institutions taking a greater interest in the potential for revenue and capital growth over time, but also by the government setting up the private rental sector task force, which has been instrumental in promoting this as an area of investment. This is a model which is popular in the US and in Europe, and the advantage of the model is that it's intended to attract people to make a lifestyle decision, which is to move into well-managed and well-run and good quality rental accommodation. One of the key issues to think about is that, unusually for property, residential homes are worth more when they're vacant than when they're let, which is completely different to how a shopping centre is valued. And of course, this discrepancy has implications when a developer is knocking on the door of the local planning authority and saying, by the way, we might struggle to deliver the preferred quantum of affordable housing or infrastructure, because actually these homes are worth slightly less when they're rented out than they would be if we were to sell them on the open market. But of course, the upside of that is we as a developer are producing a product which is in high demand and meets the challenge that is faced if we continue to only build private homes that are for sale. Because if the mortgages can't be obtained, people can't get on the housing ladder, then where do they live?
And what are the opportunities for house builders or service providers?
The opportunities in the sector revolve around partnership, because if you're going to attract an institution into a relatively new asset class, you need to convince that institution that you can both construct the product to the necessary standard, but also that the product is lettable. And that relies not just on the physical nature of the building, the quality of the community space, the shared facilities that are on offer, but it also relates to the ability of providers to let property. So that's about IT platforms, marketing, customer care and service. And it's also about their ability to then manage buildings effectively, so that the measure of success is about the length of tenancy or the number of times that a tenant repeats a request to live in a block, rather than looking necessarily at just the headline rental income.
You talked about institutional investment in this model. Would that mean that a guarantor would be required?
It really depends on which of the two approaches the institution takes. The more cautious approach is to rely on a guarantee, and that guarantee might come from a local authority or from a large housing association. And effectively in that circumstance, the guarantor is underwriting a minimum return to the fund, which gives the fund a level of a safety net. The alternative approach, which is becoming more common, is where the fund directly invests in the underlying property asset. And in that scenario, of course, the fund takes a much greater interest both in the quality of the built product, but also in the skills and the quality of the management platform and the building management arrangements thereafter.
And finally, as an in-house lawyer, what are the key things that I should be thinking about, and is there anything I need to be doing now?
Depending on who your client is, if you're a local authority, you'll probably be weighing up whether this is the sort of project which you should undertake in-house. Do you have the skills, the finance, the expertise to do it, or do you need external support, either by way of funding and on what terms, or by way of development expertise, or possibly property management expertise, if as an authority you've always managed social housing and you're now moving into the private sector. Of course, as a local authority lawyer, you can't forget the need to make sure that all of your procurement and state aid boxes are properly ticked. If you're acting for a developer or a contractor, then the most important thing is to take your tax advice early. The biggest potential risk is exposure to stamp duty, land tax, as well as VAT, and you need to make sure particularly that the VAT is recoverable. If you're an in-house lawyer for a developer or a contractor or a service provider, what you might be thinking about is what are the terms on which, as partners, we're going to create a product which the institutions are likely to invest in.
Richard Beckingsale, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks.